Good afternoon, everyone. I want to talk to you today about something that happened just hours ago in Washington, D.C., something that should make us all pause and think deeply about the direction our country is heading. 2 National Guard members were shot in what authorities are calling a targeted ambush, just blocks from the White House. The suspect has been captured. Both victims are fighting for their lives in critical condition, and our nation once again finds itself asking, how did we get here? Now, before the usual chorus of pundits reduces this to simple talking points about terrorism or immigration or law and order, I want us to think about this differently. Because what happened today near Farragut Square is not just an isolated incident of violence. It is a symptom of much deeper contradictions in American society that we refuse to confront honestly. Let me be clear from the outset. Violence against anyone, including members of our National Guard, is absolutely unacceptable. These are young men and women in uniform, and they deserve our sympathy and support, but sympathy alone will not prevent the next tragedy. We need to understand the context, the conditions, the policies that create the environment in which such violence becomes possible. Here's what we know so far. The suspect has been identified as an Afghan national who came to the United States after the chaotic American withdrawal from Afghanistan. The administration has already begun using this tragedy to call for mass deportations and increased militarization of our capital city. In fact, within hours of the shooting, the announcement came that 500 additional troops would be deployed to Washington. Think about that for a moment. Our response to violence is more troops, more guns, more military presence in our streets. Does this sound like a solution to you, or does it sound like a society spiraling into deeper crisis? Let me ask you something. Why were National Guard troops standing on street corners in Washington, D.C. in the first place? This is not a war zone, or at least it shouldn't be. These troops were deployed as part of what the current administration calls a crime crackdown, federalizing the National Guard over the objections of local officials who insisted they had the situation under control. We are watching the militarization of domestic law enforcement accelerate before our eyes, and today's tragedy will be used to justify even more of it. But here's what they won't tell you on the evening news. You cannot militarize your way out of social crisis. You cannot deploy enough troops to solve problems rooted in economic inequality, in failed foreign policy, in a system that creates desperation and then acts shocked when desperation produces desperate acts. The United States spent 20 years in Afghanistan, trillions of dollars, thousands of American lives, and for what? We left that country in chaos. We made promises to people who worked with us. We created refugees and displaced persons. And then we act surprised when some of those people arrive here traumatized, struggling, unable to integrate into a society that increasingly has no place even for its own citizens. The fundamental question we should be asking is this: what kind of society are we building? We live in the wealthiest nation in human history, yet we cannot provide housing for our homeless, health care for our sick, or adequate mental health services for those suffering from trauma. Whether they are veterans returning from our endless wars or refugees fleeing the destruction those wars created. Instead, we pour billions into military budgets, into surveillance, into policing, into creating an apparatus of control that ultimately cannot control the chaos generated by our own failed policies. And now, predictably, this tragedy will be weaponized. It will be used to demonize immigrants, to justify mass deportations, to further militarize our society, to strip away whatever remaining civil liberties we have in the name of security. We have seen this playbook before. After every crisis, the response is always the same: more power to the state, more restriction of freedom, more division among ordinary people who should be united in demanding something better. But let me suggest an alternative analysis, one you won't hear from the political establishment of either party. The problem is not too many immigrants or too few troops on the street. The problem is an economic system that creates massive inequality, that generates endless wars to secure resources and markets, that treats human beings as disposable, whether they are workers in America or civilians in Afghanistan. This system produces violence, both the structural violence of poverty and desperation, and the direct violence we witness today. And no amount of National Guard deployments will change that fundamental reality. Consider the irony: we send troops to Afghanistan to spread democracy and freedom. We create chaos and destruction. We make promises to local people who help us, promising them safety and a new life in America if they stand with us. Then, when our political leaders decide the war is no longer profitable or popular, we abandon those people. Some manage to make it to America, but they arrive in a country with no real system to help them integrate, to process their trauma, to give them the economic opportunities they need to build stable lives. They enter a society that is itself fracturing, where millions of Americans are also struggling with economic insecurity, with declining living standards, with a sense that the system has abandoned them too, and then we act shocked when this toxic mixture produces violence. Here's the truth that makes people uncomfortable. The suspect in today's shooting is both a perpetrator who must be held accountable and a product of American foreign policy. Both things can be true simultaneously. We can condemn the violence while also acknowledging that it did not emerge from nowhere, that it has a context, a history, a relationship to the decisions made by our government over decades. Now, I can already hear the objections. Wolf, are you justifying violence? Absolutely not. I am insisting that we understand it, that we trace it back to its roots, that we acknowledge our role in creating the conditions that produce it. Because if we don't, if we simply respond with more troops and more deportations and more military spending, we guarantee that this cycle will continue. We guarantee more violence, more tragedy, more families destroyed on all sides. What would a real solution look like? It would start with ending the militarization of American society, both abroad and at home. It would mean investing in social programs instead of military programs, in integration services instead of deportation forces, in mental health care instead of surveillance systems. It would mean acknowledging that our foreign policy creates the refugees and the chaos that eventually come back to haunt us. It would mean building an economy that works for everyone, that doesn't leave millions of people, whether native, born or immigrant, struggling to survive in a land of plenty. But that would require challenging the fundamental structures of power in this country. It would require standing up to the military, industrial complex, to the corporations that profit from war and from the militarization of our streets, to the politicians of both parties who have presided over this decline for decades. It would require, in short, a different kind of economic system, one oriented toward human needs rather than private profit. Instead, what we will get is predictable, more inflammatory rhetoric, more demonization of immigrants, more fear, mongering, more demands for security measures that make us less secure in the long run. The National Guard members who were shot today deserve justice, but they also deserve a country that doesn't put them in impossible situations, standing on street corners in their own capital city, serving as visible targets for the blowback from failed policies they had no role in creating. I want to close with this thought: every crisis is also an opportunity to choose a different path, to ask different questions, to imagine different solutions. But we have to be willing to think critically, to look beyond the surface, to challenge the narratives we are fed by those in power. The tragedy that unfolded today in Washington is heartbreaking, but it is not incomprehensible. It is the logical outcome of specific policy choices, of a system organized in a particular way. And if we want different outcomes, we need a different system. Thank you for listening. I know these are not easy things to hear, but we live in a time that demands honest analysis, not comfortable platitudes. My thoughts are with the families of the wounded National Guard members, and my hope is that we can build a society where such tragedies become impossible, because we have finally addressed their root causes. Thank you.